to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss why Hoppe and Paul are right and Mises and Moldbug are wrong. Tim.
Why Moldbug's post-libertarian is mostly wrong. That'd be a more precise title here, but I included some other words in the title here. Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin, popular figure on the dissident right for a number of years, dispute with the Hoppian anarchists, as well as Rothbardian anarchists, whom both of them like each other in a sense. Like, Hoppe and Yarvin has had lunch to supposedly speak with each other. But I would say that Moldbug / Yarvin, I'll just refer to him as Moldbug, doesn't say this, but he's arguably as a Misesian. And Mises is an advocate of the night watchman pro-minimum state. I mean, he's Mises himself, to get into side baseball here, he's like friends with Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand is, of course, a minimum state advocate, a minarchist, as the modern parlance says. And the minimum state, as Hoppe argues, becomes a maximum quite quickly. This state ends up becoming a looting process, especially if done democratically. Anarcho-tyranny or a failed state will result eventually. Moldbug makes the mistake that Hoppe criticizes in his book, The Democracy That God That Failed, in his chapter entitled The Errors of Classical Liberalism. That to me has always been the central chapter of The Democracy That God That Failed. That's where it's going, because guys like Mises, the so-called classic liberals, are advocates of democracy, as well as Hayek for that matter, or at least they view democracy as an improvement over monarchy because kings are not above the law. And Hoppe will make the point that public officials, and he does this in his lecture as well as a chapter, that public officials are actually in a sense worse than kings. So Hoppe becomes a kind of monarchist. Now, whether he is a monarchist or not, or just like I would call him a Burkean monarchist. If you had like a Burkean as in Edmund Burke, if you had like different options and you had to pick the least bad option, you'd pick monarchy based on time preference. But I think this is what Moldbug gets wrong about Hoppe. Now, whether Hoppe himself admits this or not, or has changed his view, is a good question. But Hoppe himself is not a monarchist. He still views it bad. It's like picking between a looter or a mugger who has a joke that says that $10 or all your dollar or almost all your dollars. So that's Moldbug's big error. Is his statism here? How a small private state will become a failed one or an anarcho-tyrannical one. And he's very big on bringing up all the instances of anarcho-tyranny. But I would say he takes Hoppe's defense of monarchy in a backhanded manner and turns it into monarchies are the best form of states. And we did this somewhat in our episode on why J.S. Mill and Mises are wrong about a year ago here. And you could sort of get into you Hoppe and phrase, you get bogged into the technical details here. But a family or a small firm, or even a medium-sized firm, contrary to Thaddeus Russell's belief, is not a mini state, and Hoppe has a lecture on this. Moldbug's advocate of private dictatorships in the commercial setting, as David Friedman says, that most successful businesses are run by, and Moldbug will say this too, most successful businesses are private dictatorships. Well, of course, but those people aren't bossing you around all the time. It's not a total totalitarian thing. The state is an entity which does lots of things. And that's another thing that Moldbug misses here is like the growth of the state. I mean, he reads books by like Burnham about the managerial revolution, and he knows them quite well. I've made my way through both the books he's recommended on this, and they're excellent. But you start with a small state, and you end up with a large state here, which is the regulatory managerial state. And that is another thing which, he ends up praising people like FDR in a sense as being like Machiavellians of a kind. Okay, so he wants to sort of reboot the U.S. government, but reboot it to do what? Reboot it to do why? In a sense, you should abolish it. And actually, some of his solutions here, I would say, are backwards here, in the sense that in his interview with Dave Smith was making the point that if there is a real economy out there, if anything, that real economy, quote unquote, which isn't being choked out by easy money and regulations and all things, is actually stronger than ever. This is where Mises, being a good economist, would say this flight to real value. And this is the part where Mises is great. Sound money. But do we have sound money here in Britain, the United States? Not really, let alone places like Japan. And in that interview with Dave Smith again, Moldbug would say, like, if your dad's sick, running a marathon is good for you, but the marathon will kill him at some point. And in a sense, he's right here. In a sense that Yarvin Moldbug is right that, like, if you keep running a marathon, that maybe the West is financially, but then the West is just criminal in that regard. It's just exploitative, as the Marxists would argue. Um, that it just runs on money printing and so to speak. But even so, he's not entirely he misses this argument here. If you take Peter Zien's work, which has some like concordance with Moldbug, as well as Todd Lewis, although I'm not ever sure if Todd Lewis is taking this serious or not, in his defense of empires with Keith Preston, as well as his work on Tom Wood's show, the U.S. does protect global shipping. Yes, plenty of the wars are stupid, the United States does, but you can have globalism, according to Peter Zien, and I think it's a fairly sound argument, without U.S. destroyers and formerly British destroyers basically protecting against piracy and other sorts of rogue types of mercantilism. So all this trade that he talks about is predicated on the United States. So maybe the free money printing, and the Pentagon's budget grows every year. So maybe the U.S. does provide a service, and is the backbone of it. If you take the neocon, neo-lib propaganda seriously, you end up with that. So maybe the U.S. does do a virtuous service. It's not purely criminal if you take a view. Again, Moldbug's a statist, Mises is statist. Hayek is complicated. So I guess the question for let's get the origin of laws question here, and that's why I brought Paul in here. So, like, can you have such thing as a private state? Now, some people say that's a contradiction in terms, and Hoppe would call this a private law society. So, what kind of laws would the private law society enforce here? That, to me, is the question here, because a lot of the critics would just say, well, this is just going to be warlords taking over. Now, you could use that warlordism to describe the current state of affairs. And this is where the anarcho-tyranny example comes in. Like he makes fun of this, and he's correct to do so, Moldbug, as well as Mises. Not that Mises was in the same time as us, but he makes fun of this. But the state today, and this is where Hoppe's point about the gangs is a quote unquote above the law. Are any of the state bureaucrats really ever forget qualified immunity? I mean, are any major political leaders or bureaucrats in the managerial state ever really held account? No, it's if anything, they benefit from them, benefit from being criminals here. So what kind of laws would they force? State law or law that's privately generated on the market? Now, see, this is why one of the reasons I put Paul in the Paul in is what is the market for laws? Well, I would say the market for laws, you almost have to have a sort of transcendental origin story for laws. Otherwise laws are just fiat or operational. So Moldbug and Mises and Hoppe will all make fun of Hayek. But Hayek, to me, actually comes up with a better secular theory of the law's origin than Moldbug does. Because the question is, of course, if you have a private, so to speak, a private right protection agency, what kind of laws would they enforce? Would they just enforce their fiat will, or would they enforce something else? Would they enforce natural law? And so natural law, I always have a kind of dodgy relationship with in my own head. But I can sort of get why you can have it. So that's my sort of over out here. You need some origin story for laws. I don't think Moldbug and Mises has it, which is one of the reasons why I think they end up becoming classical liberal statists. Now, they're fairly good on most areas, but not on this one area. So the question is, what laws would be enforced? Where do they come from? Swithin, what do you make of my spiel here on Moldbug's errors here? I think Hoppe is very good at going after the errors of classical liberals. Mises is great on everything but except this origin story, and this origin thing, not the origin story, this small state. It through the managerial revolution, it just grows and grows and grows. And you sort of can say there's conventions that lead to their growth here, like the regulatory state. Well, it wouldn't be reasonable if you didn't have to have this, if your floors weren't slippery. Okay, well, let's create a bureaucracy to do that. and slowly these grow. And then Moldbug has no account for the growth of this state. He's right to be disgusted by it, as all of them are. But I would say, in this sense, his recommendations are backwards. So, what do you make of my spiel here, Swithin?
I think you have hit upon a lot of correct areas. I think the problem ultimately with the Hobbesian outlook, which I think um, Mises and Moldbug have, is is that they think that law is essentially arbitrary and needs to be just sort of enforced by the strongest will and the strongest power. Otherwise, you're just going to have competing interests that are diametrically opposed, and you'll just have violence. I don't think that's true. I think that if you have things like, if you take a natural law position, I mean, clearly within uh, the family, there is reasons to act in particular ways, and also with your neighbor as well. I mean, yes, I suppose in certain circumstances in which you might be able to exploit your neighbor or basically enslave him in certain ways. I mean, people you might do that if it's in your interest potentially, but there's many reasons to why you wouldn't even want to bother doing so, and in many cases you don't really have the means to do so. When it comes to law generation, I think it's sort of, this gets into a weird definition of term things. It's kind of, what is a law? In this case, a law, I think, is something which, if you violate it, the community sort of accepts that you can deal with this person differently than you would otherwise be able to. I think that's kind of what a law is in practice. I know there's various other definitions. I mean, so for instance, Thomas Aquinas will say an ordinance of reason for the common good spread by one who's in charge of the community. Yeah, okay, you could use the term law that way. I don't know. There's reasons to do it, but the nature of law does seem to be that. So then the question arises, why do people think certain things are okay to do to other people if they do something, and why is it not it's okay to do it? So, I mean, for instance, if you got people arrested because of like coronavirus violations, the only reason that could take place is because you had significantly number of people who wouldn't try and oppose such action by the police on the people who are breaking like lockdown restrictions, etc. And also enough of the police who actually carried on and enforced it, because obviously if they didn't think it was correct to enforce, then of course they wouldn't have done. So I think when you come to law, I mean, you're kind of going into culture, and you're going into why certain laws develop. And I think this is where sort of like Hayek is right in his kind of evolutionary approach to law. Although I would say that for Aquinas, I don't think it's just sort of, in a sense, arbitrary or merely pragmatic. I think people look at the way humans are and the human nature. What are the goals of humans, and then can create a system of rational law which can be sort of like from the bottom up. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a body which says what the law is or is not. I mean, we discussed this when we looked at I think it was the Supreme Court episode, that essentially for a group of people, you need somebody to basically define what the law is. Because if they have come into a dispute, if one person thinks they commit an offence and the other doesn't, abortion is the obvious example. And practically speaking, the easiest way of conceiving of that situation arising is the father with a dispute against the mother of the aborted child. I mean, that would be the easiest way of conceiving that scenario. Have they committed offence or have they not? I mean, you kind of need a judgment on that. But I think that's sort of a process which takes place sort of at a certain level of development. I mean, prior to that, you're probably going to have heads of, well, basically patriarchs of various descriptions who would sort of decide on what that is. Now, that said, now the Hobbesian will say, well, yes, but you need to be able to enforce those laws. And of course, yes, you will at some point. But I think where the Hobbesian goes wrong is to say that you need a singular body to do it. Now, it might be true that the lawmaking body would need some of its own sort of troops or retained fighting men of certain description. But there's no reason why, if people were abiding by the law in general, well, by which I mean abiding, I mean if they were providing sort of legal services or whatever. By legal service, I mean trials and just the mechanical. Have you broken this law? Yes, and then what an appropriate punishment is. If they're within that, I don't see why it would necessitate having a singular system to pull that off. And I think that's the major error of along with the Hobbesianism. That's the major error of the sort of the minarchists, is thinking that a single body of law requires a single single enforcer of it. Oh, and secondly, as well, the logic of the as well, which is why they look, I think, law in a sort of a bad way, is I think the logical conclusion of sort of the minarchist view is to have one world minarchist state, because everyone must be conformed to this sort of singular law, which is that of minarchism, which of course is a problem because, again, it misunderstands how and why laws are generated that they are. And the approach I've outlined explains why different countries end up with different norms and different laws. Whereas the minarchist would want to, you could argue, would want to sort of impose it on everybody else. And this is why, for instance, some minarchists would like the federal government, say in America, over the state governments, because it's less oppressive than the state government. So when you mention which law would the Rights Protection Agency defend, well, whatever the law is in that area. I've suggested in the past, if you have a situation of lots of micro political communities, you basically then have sort of competition between laws in each of those areas, however those are generated. But yeah, I mean, if it is the case that if you've got two people with two different legal views, then yes, you could negotiate, you could fight, or you could leave and go somewhere else. I think that answers your questions or your comment. I think it does. If not, tell me.
Oh yes, I was the outline of the answer is pretty good. You brought up the point which I forgot to bring up, which is Hoppe's insight is fairly elementary because most classical liberal economists will hold the view that competition is bad. I don't think Moldbug himself would hold this. If you only had one cell phone company or one restaurant, would you have very good quality of service? Probably not. If you had more competing against each other, this is the logic of competition. You're going to have better food. Now, the question is, why isn't this true for everything else? In particular, this very important area, namely law production and law enforcement. And there's never really an answer given other than, well, actually, in this instance, and this is Hoppe will bring this up in his areas of classical liberalism, in this instance, there is actually monopolies are actually good or virtuous or useful, depending on your format here. And this is why I think the origin of law question is useful here, because you have on the one hand the sort of monopoly question here, which is it's an elementary insight relative to Hoppe. Not that now he's brilliant to point it out in such a clear, concise manner, but the actual thinking here shows up in many areas here. That like his private dictatorship model, Moldbug, as well as Dave Friedman has this for when he's getting into arguments with Ben Burgess. That is true that small mid-sized corporations are not democratic, but this is like a term problem here. The state is very much different. Even Moldbug will admit that the state is very much different, and so will Mises here. But then why are you saying that one state is better? if you take the logic seriously, it's just as you stated, you need a one world government. And then in practice, this just ends up being whichever the largest state around here. So in the Roman Empire's day, it was Rome. Now it's the United States here. Uh, so far from being a laugher. I mean, they like to make fun of like the American invasion of Afghanistan, but as Todd Lewis would say, Moldbug sometimes becomes a kind of Christopher Hitchens like figure here. So maybe the United States should go around, spreading one world monarchy here. Now he's a critic of the United States, very much so, Moldbug. But that would I would say is the sort of central crux. But so I want to discuss like why do people obey laws here? And that's one of the reasons I brought Paul in here is I think there's a bottom up nature to laws which gets missed. Hayek doesn't miss it. If anyone's listened to Russ Roberts, you can criticize Russ Roberts for a lot of things, but I think he's a fairly good evangelist for Hayek. I think one of the virtues of Hayek is Hayek recognizes the bottom-up nature thing. This is the use of knowledge in society. This is the his theories of law here. Because I would say Hayek is a more thoroughgoing atheist consistently than, and Gary North agrees with this as well, than Mises is. Now, Gary North is a fundamentalist Christian, which Mises and Moldbug are not here. But this is why I bring up Paul here, that, why do people obey laws? I'd say one of the reasons people obey laws, in true Socratic form, is it benefits them. Why don't, one of the reasons is like, why don't you steal? Why do you generally obey public traffic laws? Why, I drive on the correct side of the road because, like, I would get killed if I didn't do it. That's a fairly reasonable thing. I can imagine an alternate universe. That alternate universe exists in Australia, United Kingdom, where the other side is. That's a convention. Hoppe will bring up those conventions. Hoppe will also bring up the convention of alphabets. There are certain things that you could easily imagine them being differently, but there are certain rules that but the rules of correct driving in general, they basically make sense here. You can tweak what the precise rules are. But you have to sort of pay attention. You have to, the same way with operating horses or something like that. So there are sort of rules, and like you just get killed if you didn't obey them. You, the individual here, you didn't get killed. You don't necessarily need a sign to say don't jump over a fence and fall in. Although sometimes they have them, or don't put your hand on a hot stove. Certain rules are reasonable here, and everyone just sort of obeys them in a praxeological like manner. Like if they didn't do it, they'd die. Don't eat poison, things like that. But there's other rules about other people. Now, we sort of discussed this with Rick's story on this virtue of selfishness episode here, so now we're doing rules of others. It's one thing that like I take care of myself because I like myself, but then we have to deal with other people's property as well as other people's bodies here, and this is where you say, well, the minarchists would say we need a state to deal with these disputes here. As stated, the state's a monopolist, but they still think in this instance the state would actually be a useful thing to adjudicate disputes here. This is where I disagree here. You would want competition here. You wouldn't want one provider of defense and legal services here. You want lots of providers. And then which one would they do here? But back to the origin, back to like why would the sort of low people obey? Well, one reason the low people obey is there are Christians here. And this is a historical fact I think gets missed by Moldbug. Here you get the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and then you get the Christianization of large parts of the world here. Now, there's plenty of excesses. There's plenty of disagreements about what Christianity is internally, of course. And there's plenty of like disputes over are the Catholics correct, the Lutherans, the Anabaptists? Oh yeah, hundreds of disputes. But you sort of see a patchwork developing with a lot of force and a lot of violence, of course. But I would say less violence than in the previous series. So one reason why the proles and the low people would obey the laws is precisely, the sort of religious reason. Now, why would the top? Well, the top would obey it for also the same reasons that I stated, like the conventional reasons. I imagine when Bill Gates drives, he ever does, he drives on the right side of the road. I imagine he, eats with a fork, uses things like that. But then the other rules of the other people. This is where, again, the classical liberals have problems because the present-day bureaucrats are sort of like kings in the sense that politicians are above the law. Monarchies was above the law, but so are like politicians and other things. So instead of just being a less bad, they end up supporting. I don't think bringing back. Hoppe made the karma that if you brought Charles back, I actually think Charles might be a worse governor than the current ruler of Britain. But that's disputed here. I don't know about that. But the true goal would be a system which doesn't require states. Now, what would that look like? Well, I think your outline as well as my outline of why people would believe it is towards an explanation here. I think this is important to make this explanation because I think in order to get there, you have to at least diagnose the problems and have a solution which isn't part of the problem. And Dave Smith has a great show name, Part of the Problem here. So I think you have to sort of get in the errors and Mises here and the errors of Moldbug. So what do you make of why do people obey laws? Why do lower members of society obey? Am I on to something with the bring up Paul and Christianity here? Am I on to something there as well as the other comments with him?
I think you're right to bring up Paul to some extent. In that, I think a lot of people will follow laws because they think they ought to do so, as in they think it is part of to our previous episode on ideal life, and part of an ideal life is being law abiding, because keeping the law is doing that which is good. And so, if you can make enough people think that what they are doing is actually in their own interest to follow the law, then people will do so. I mean, you can see this in disputes with. I think it's a good explanation. Is with Uber and taxi drivers in London. When Uber came on the scene in London, the taxi drivers obviously very opposed to them because, oh no, they're getting rid of all our business. Because they're using the Uber and not using the taxi, and they've been undercut, and taxi drivers are going to go out of business. But so what they did is to go, oh no, well, Uber haven't really got these licenses like we have. We're doing the right thing by getting the licenses. Rather than the taxi drivers going, well, why don't we just get rid of the license anyway? Why can't we just compete on an even playing field, not by making Uber jump through more hoops, but just making us to jump through fewer hoops? Now, there's lots of historical contingencies as to why that's the case. They've always done it, status quo bias, etc., etc. But it's still like, well, why follow the law? Because you think, that it's just and in a sense you should follow it. Now, there are clearly those laws which people follow just because they would be punished if they didn't. But these tend to be ones that people think are typically more arbitrary, like speed limits is probably the best example of that. Whilst people recognise, driving dangerously is bad and I shouldn't do it and it'd be immoral for me to do so. Just driving a little bit faster on a particular road, people go, no, that's not really a crime, is it? I think a lot of time people follow laws because they think they ought to follow them. The question arises, why do they think they ought to follow them? And I think there's a bit of an interplay between law, punishment and also cultural change. And I think I may have mentioned before, the best example, which I really should do some study on at some point, hopefully someone's done lots of the legwork for me, is on smoking. The legal prohibitions on smoking have been sort of tightened slightly at the same time as well as a cultural change against it. So there's now people think that smoking is basically in a sense immoral. It is bad for you. And in a sense, you don't need that many laws on restrictions of smoking because most people just wouldn't do it. Now, some people would, and maybe it would change again if that happened and people would become more socially acceptable. But the way it was done with some sort of legal sanctions and violence, and by violence I mean fines or potentially imprisonment. I imagine you would do if you didn't pay the fines. And cultural change from media, etc., I think makes a big difference when we're talking about that. Just a slightly separate point. You mentioned the market for law. I think that you can't. I think talking about a market for law is not necessarily the best way of using the term market, depending how we want to mean it. If we mean that people buy and sell to come up with laws then okay, that might be a market. But unlike, and so in that sense, contract law could be freely chosen. Law merchants and stuff, that makes sense because you've got two contractually obligated participants. But when you have, say, criminal law or tort law, the other party hasn't agreed to it. So the idea that you have with markets of exchange being mutually beneficial doesn't really work. Now, when it as such, so having a market in the same way for laws as you have for TVs is not the same. Now, I do think you can have a market for judges. You can go to one judge or another. Although I do think that's going to be attenuated in a case in which somebody refuses to submit to any judge at all. Then I suppose you've got the option of declaring them outlaw. You try them in absentia, or you force them to appear at a court. And so, in a sense, that means you're forced to buy the product at some point. So, and again, that would be different than buying the pizza because, well, you don't have to buy the pizza. So, I do think talking about the market for law is not the best way of talking about it for that reason, because I think it is significantly disanalogous to most of the usage of the term market.
So you say it's disanalogous, and you say it's a bad term, but then I could ask the question: what would be a better term? And it maybe is like it gets like a question: is the minarchist right here? Then maybe there is an exception. You can't actually have laws because there is. I've written the Epstein who runs the Libertarian. I think the Cato Institute put this on. I mean, he's a minarchist, and he's pretty good at it, being a minarchist. And he says that he'll bring up the point that you just made that like there'll be people who just say, well, they don't want that judge because they know either they know they're guilty or they know they're guilty of that law, or most, and they'll of course reject all judges here. So this goes back to my problem with like the origins of law here. Like so, like the atheist non-religious person has a problem with like law origins here. Like we did an episode, why is murder wrong? I got some amount of criticism on that because like I basically held the view that either things are wrong because God says they are wrong, or there's no real reason other than brute force of secular powers. Uh, uh, and I when I go to like like when I talk about like if someone stole a TV from you, and this is a classic or someone stole a hat here for like classic Walter Block example, and I said, oh, that was my hat, and to go all down all the rabbit holes, I actually did make that hat. It meets all those standards here. Could I steal it back from you? And if I came back and steal it back from you and used force to do so, would I be a murderer? Well, that was my property, and I'm trying to get back my hat. So am I a murderer here? Well, then why is murder wrong to begin with here? And that's a very much of an autistic sort of a deep dive into sort of like origins here. But like uh, at some point you have to have a mechanism which to go after. At some point you have to use a force and aggression to go after, so to speak, wrongdoers, as you or as society or as the RPA or as the state sees fit. I mean, Alex Jones had to submit, just an example, to and Ted Kaczynski, as well as plenty of blacks and Hispanics and others had to submit to state courts. Like what separates state courts from just everyone else? If I had a mock court and you and we said, oh, that person is guilty, no, that person is innocent, so Walter Block uses the analogy of the Catholic Church, and I think this is a useful analogy here. The Catholic Church doesn't have formal legal power in the United States or Western Europe, but it has sort of some ceremonial with prestige power. Like if the Pope says you're a heretic, he won't throw you in jail here. Now that's not like actual violent thing here, but let's say if I to use the Walter Blocking hat example, if I stole your hat, or let's even worse, if I murdered your wife here, and everyone basically figured this out that I was the guilty person, I would do that. But if I did, who, let's just say the protection from me goes away, and someone, you hire someone to go kill me here. Well, now is that person who went and killed me a murderer? Well, no, I would say that person is just doing quote unquote justice as most people see fit. But technically, that's a form of aggression here. Technically, that's a form of aggression done by you back towards me to in the name of enforcing the law. The Amish, of course, and the Quakers are interesting because, like, when they get hit with aggression, and we did an episode on Are They Free Riders, they would sing hymns and not do things and stuff like that. Sing hymns when they get robbed, if they do get robbed. They would go full martyr mode immediately here. I mean, the Amish had a school. Someone shot up at Amish church once, and they had an offering plate towards the mother of the the shooter, I think. So there is a sense in which justice is extra legal, and like, of course, like, justice done by the state is obviously extra legal here. Like, there's no way in which Julian Assange, is quote unquote just. And this, I think, leads to people like me, as well as people like Foucault and at times Hayek and Thaddeus Russell, from just taking the view that justice is just a kind of shoddy idea to begin with here. That justice is basically analogous with state tyranny. What justice traditionally means is just whatever the state says is tyrannical. So, Swithin, what do you make of the thing? Do you agree that the enforcement of justice, like whatever that society or things be, is a kind of, in practice, an unjust process here? So, like, if you do steal something, you have to quote unquote steal it back. If the death penalty is the punishment, you have to hire somebody, or you yourself or the community has to go and murder that partner. Do you agree that in some strict sense that probably violates some version of the NAP, or does it not? Or does it not? Swithin?
I don't think it necessarily violates the NAP. The NAP merely states that aggression is wrong, the initiation of force when somebody hasn't violated anybody's rights as determined by the NAP. But if someone has violated the rights of the NAP, then they're fair game. That's just the just response. So I don't see why that's necessarily a problem with respect to Epstein and, like, well, won't submit to this court, you won't submit to that court. I mean, yeah, I mean there are going to be situations in which individuals won't submit to particular courts, but I mean, but that doesn't. But those edge cases, the question is how many cases would they be, whether or not that kind of justifies the state having the singular monopoly on being the decider in this case, the arbiter. I may have used this definition before. When it comes to what is a state, I basically say that the state is somebody who monopolizes the arbitration function of law, and is the only body that declares itself to pronounce judgments that are socially sanctioned. That is, if a state judge says, "Well, yes, you should be executed," everyone goes, "Yeah, okay, you're gonna be executed, fine." That's what the state says. But if another party had a court proceeding and said that, then they wouldn't. But of course, if they monopolize the arbitration service, they'd never really get to sentencing anyway. That's really where I'd say sort of the state lies in what it means to be the state. So the state needs to have sort of some level of what am I thinking? Legitimization. It has to be considered just by some people to exist, but it also needs to have force to enact its punishment. So it's not just a mafia gang. Although some people, you could argue that's a proto-state in certain respects. So that's the way I would sort of look at what the state is. And given my definition of state, I just don't think that's necessary. Whilst it might be necessary in certain edge cases to forcibly try people, if it's the case, I can imagine a society in which, if everybody knows what the law is, I mean, interesting, Hoppe mentions that early on in monarchical societies, the king was considered the enforcer of justice, and the law was pre-existed the king, and it was only later in monarchical situations where the king was seen as a fount of law and could determine what the law is, rather than just enforcing. Basically, he was the guy who only had the right to enforce the law. I guess it's a situation where you have the law and there's lots of people who can enforce it. I don't see why that necessarily leads to one enforcer of it. And but if it did, having a situation whereby you have lots of geographically small states, I say they may not necessarily have to be states in the sense in which I use the term state. This allows for different people who have different cultures and views to get together to have laws which sort of better fit that community. That's not to say that the laws are necessarily relative, but it's clearly certain practices that work in, say, America don't work in Saudi Arabia or Iraq. And that would also then allow competition in the sense that people could move to the places where they preferred the legal arrangements to those areas where they didn't. And clearly, the smaller the area, the easier it is to move because of less reasons not to move when you can see all your family members, whatever, who happen to live in a slightly different jurisdiction. So I think that Richard Epstein is correct in certain respects, but I don't think his conclusion follows. It's kind of like the same argument that like Ed Fayes would use. Oh, well, we know that some people, if we respected property rights, absolutely would starve because they couldn't steal. Oh, therefore, what we need is taxation to make sure that no one starves. It's like that doesn't follow in any way, shape, or form. And I think Richard Epstein is basically pulling an analogous error.
I think also this is where I think the perfect is the enemy of the good. Which again I think that's the reason why I brought it in Paul here. There could be a way, and in your quotes on Aquinas here, I think are interesting here, in the sense that it could be that all quote unquote, if indeed, it could be that all earthly forms of justice are incomplete. Which again, this is where I think people like Foucault are correct. Even if the term means things that are reasonable, there's plenty of instances where the state or the authorities do it unreasonably. Hoppe himself admits there's plenty of bad kings here in his there's plenty of bad kings, but there's also plenty of bad, quote, so to speak, democratic bureaucrats and democratic in the sense that they're operating on, quote, so to speak, liberal democracy, not the party, although the party too included. But there are plenty of and they are in a sense above the law. They do things which, if other quote unquote normal people, everyday people would do them, would be considered be criminal here. They don't obey the law, so to speak. So this is where do they get justice? Well, no, obviously not. When the state steals churches, a guy who's taking the church's money to a bank, offering because they use it as drug money, do they give it back? Well, under threat of public opinion, they do. But if you want to go buy a boat, the ATF might try to seize that $10,000 you're carrying in your glove compartment. Here, there's a number of instances where this has happened here, and there's a number of other instances where they just outright just take all your money in the bank here. So the state does lots of criminal things. Does anyone hold the state to account? Well, unless the state gets occupied by a foreign power, not really. I mean, maybe there's some obscurance in some people somewhere along the lines. So, like on our punishment episodes, in a sense, we all have to be, and this is why I think Paul's useful again. We all have to be, in some sense, to some degree, forgiving here. And I think the nature of a decentralized system here, if states indeed are necessary. But see, if you admit that they're necessary, they have to admit that a one world government are necessary. So you can't, if you can't fully admit that without you have to make some reason why there have to be many states, not one state. Now you can maybe do that through an aversion to monopolies. So that does open up the door for a Mises, Hoppe and Moldbug synthesis. But you could say, well, then if I don't want to submit, I can go flee to somewhere else. But in this kind of world, if I flee to somewhere else, will they want me? Well, if I'm Julian Assange, I mean, I can imagine lots of people that want them. If you could actually break out of the jail cell he's in, I imagine plenty of people would put him up free of charge. He's not really a threat to order. But if he is a actual threat to order, by as described, then he wouldn't be free. And we did an episode on punishment. What would punishment look like in an ideal society? It could just be more banishment. And if you don't like Catholic rules, maybe you could try to emigrate to a Saudistan. If you don't like Saudistan, maybe you could immigrate to Japanistan. But see, this is where I think having competing laws would be a virtue, because now that would be depend on them accepting you too, or if they might have an open borders policy, so maybe they'll just automatic let you in here. So that would be my solution. There is some amount of leakage that would happen, but what tends to get forgotten is there's plenty of instances of unjust acts. And Moldbug bring up the claim, like, when you're in a city, in certain cities in the United States, he'll use the example, well, do you fear the police more, or do you fear the local gang more, or do you fear like private tyranny, so to speak? Small petty theft. Okay, well, those instances I do feel small private theft of certain groups. But if you get technical, Moldbug, one reason why you can't just carry. I think in certain American cities, if you carry a loaded weapon without a permit, you're basically a felon if they catch you. And this is where anarcho-tyranny is actually at reign, not petty, not and it's the state's actually going after, as Hans Hoppe points, law-abiding citizens. So you can't personally defend yourself quite easily. Now, this is obviously true in places like Canada and Britain, where it's an outright crime to defend yourself. So this is another instance where the state has anarcho-tyrannical sense crept in. Excuse me there. So if you get into the technical details of the examples, there are some errors in there here. So yeah, some leakage of justice will occur if indeed justice exists. If indeed it does exist and it's not merely some sort of fiat. And if it is only fiat, then you want the best system. The best system will arise here, or maybe the worst system will arise. So I'm fully open to Hoppe being wrong, and as well as Paul being wrong here. But then, like, what exactly is the alternative here? And it's not clear they lay out a very good alternative here, and they don't really account for why the small states of like the late 1800s turned into the large managerial states here within a good number of years. That'd be my comment here. What do you make of like the leakage point here, and what do you make of like the banishment point here? Is that a useful thing? Like, so like if the person who doesn't want to submit, if he just if the small society would just kick him out and he has to go somewhere else, would that be a useful way to deal with the problem?
It's certainly a possible way. I don't know if that's going to be the best way of doing it in every single occasions, but yeah, certainly. That's true. And yeah, I think you're right. You are going to get leakage in these situations. I think the idea that you can have perfect justice on earth is just absurd. You're not going to. I mean, you get leakage today. I mean, the heck, what's he called? Roman Polanski left America when he had the child sex case on him. He just disappeared to France. That's what Julian Assange should have done. Go to France. They will not extradite you to America because the French never do. Although they may have done in the case of Assange, possibly. But you're much safer in France than you are in England. We just do everything the Americans say. Assange. So
my other comment was like on like Moldbug says you have to fear private crime from like certain gangs in certain cities here rather than the police. What do you make of that? Like, my quick response would be, if you look into technical details, you can't defend yourself even in the United States, which has a Second Amendment, let alone Europe. What do you make of that comment here?
Oh yeah, no, that's entirely true, and I think it misses the entire context. It's like, oh, who do you fear? It's like, well, why don't I fear the police? Because I've already paid my protection money, otherwise known as I have already paid the IRS or HM Revenue and Customs. Because otherwise the police might come and say, well, you haven't paid it. It's like, well, I'm not. Well, we're going to come and take you away. Well, in which case I'm going to fear the police. So I think that misses the overall context in which the police operate. And yes, certainly there are many cases. I mean, it's so annoying. It's like, oh no, there's teenagers in London, and they're carrying knives. It's like, oh no, this is a great crime. It's like, hang on, they're in London. It looks like there might be some violence. I'm pretty sure it'd be a decent idea to carry a knife. Because if you get attacked, well, you can attack someone who's attacking you. Like, surely that makes sense. Oh no, it's really terrible. It's like, what? So you want these kids to go around unarmed into areas where there's actual criminals who just ignore the law anyway? I mean, so yeah, I definitely think there's anarcho-tyranny at work. What I would say is, again, I don't wish to go around to defend the police, but but the functions that police perform, which I think there's multiple. You could say that they're preventative of crime and they kind of investigate crime. I mean, they are two good functions. You would want those to take place. But who performs them better, and whether you need the police as a singular body to do it is another question. Again, though, on other group, people will say, well, if you have private police, they'd be worse than the actual police. And so, I suppose they might. They might be. But again, we're going to get to the same sort of general points we've outlined before, that you can have sort of essential competition in certain respects, in different areas of different packages of services, and so yeah, it is true that some people do fear private crime more than the government. That's true. I mean, the government does provide a semblance of order if you keep the rules that they tell you have to keep, and then you might be okay or fine. But that's not that much different from the protection racket from the mafia. So, yeah, Moldbug.
Or if you define it in the worst way, it wouldn't be that much different than the right protection agencies that anarchist libertarians advocate as a solution here. Now, maybe that's a slight toward them, but like, wouldn't you want one that intends to operate competitively? Maybe not. Maybe goes into libertarian, like, you don't want competitive a kidnapper here. Okay, well, see, then the state, Augustine. Let's go back to the Paul point. Then Augustine will say the state without justice is just a gang of robbers. Well, then the state is just a gang of robbers here. Okay, so we should just have an aversion to the state, not advocate monarchies. We should just say, well, state agents are criminals. Maybe they're necessary, but see, you can't say there's such thing as a necessary criminal here. And this is where Mises and gets a lot, I think, Kant in him, and so does Moldbug, where it's like they're very logical in a sense, but like they don't want to swallow the whole. They don't want to swallow the whole program here, and that's why I think the irritant here. The anarchists are much more pure. And whether Hoppe himself is out anarchist, he's become more monarchist this way. But that would be my point here. That, like, you have to sort of swallow the whole program here in a sense. And if the state is just a gang of robbers here, which I think is. I do think this police has useful functions, but why couldn't those useful functions be done on a quote unquote market? I don't see why. If crime was committed against me, you could have let's say there's a charity. If you can't afford to have the justice done, you have Gary North Inc. or you have Margaret Sanger Inc. And they sort of like compete here. I think Walter Block's example of the Catholic Church today is very useful here, of like what might competing justice or competing gangs would look like. That'd be my point here. What do you make of that?
I think yes, that can happen. I mean, I think it all comes back to law. I mean, if these bodies these groups, these police services are acting within whatever the law is within a particular area, then fine. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable. Like, you go to private security are doing things that are legal, and as long as they keep within that and they're not sort of outlaw police forces or whatever, then that's absolutely fine. The question is whether that's possible. Is the question. But then, even if it's not, I would then say, well, we know that small states exist in the case of Liechtenstein, Andorra, etc. So then, why couldn't you just have those kind of situations? Now, of course, you could say, well, they're very particular, but I mean, and then you could say, well, they're not really sovereign, because then you get the idea that, well, actually, no, they're part of the American hegemony, etc. You can always go there, but I mean, we've at least got prima facie reason to believe that that's possible. But it's an interesting topic, Tim. And I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.